Welcome to medulla oblongata. The medulla is the least sophisticated and the lowest part of the brain. It is placed at the lowest level and joins the spinal cord at the spino-medullary junction. It therefore runs from the spino-medullary junction to the ponto-medullary junction, where it meets the pons at a sharp edge. It has the following surfaces: dorsal surface, a ventral surface, and a lateral surface. The functions of the medulla. The medulla is a seat of primitive reticular formation which begins to be formed in the lowest vertebrates, such as the fishes. This reticular formation is the most sophisticated motor coordinating unit in these animals, that is, the fishes. In higher vertebrates, however, other centers have taken over the motor control, and in man, the control resides in the highest level of the neuraxis, called the neocortex. The medulla controls the vegetative aspects of the body. Thus, it controls the cardiovascular and respiratory systems and is able to provide a cardiac center, which includes a cardio-acceleratory center and a cardio-inhibitory center. Also, the center for the control of respiratory function is found in the medulla. Thus, if the medulla is dead, there can be no chance that cardiorespiratory function will continue. The medulla provides the largest center for the nucleus of cranial nerves. In the fishes, it provides the center for all cranial nerves, but in man, it only provides the center for the following cranial nerves: hypoglossal, accessory, vagus, glossopharyngeal, and part of the vestibulocochlear nerve, that is, the 8th to the 12th cranial nerves. The medulla provides a highly functioning reticular formation. The medulla provides a center for the nuclei of second-order neurons of the posterior column tracts. These tracts, although primitive, are actually a sophistication over the previous sensory system of the lower vertebrates and the higher invertebrates. Gross anatomy. The medulla is rounded in shape with three surfaces as mentioned previously. The ventral surface is marked by the junction of the medulla with the pons. It is provided with a median sulcus called the anteromedian sulcus, which is continuous with the same sulcus in the spinal cord. The sulcus separates the two bilateral pyramids which flank it at the upper medulla. Lateral to the pyramids are a sulcus which is continuous with the anterolateral sulcus are the rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve. They occupy this sulcus, which is termed the olivopyramidal sulcus. Lateral to this sulcus is the olive. This upper medullary structure forms a prominence lateral to the sulcus and the pyramid. Lateral to the olive and a bit to the lateral surface of the medulla at its upper part is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. But before this peduncle, we have a sulcus called the post-olivary sulcus, which houses the rootlets of the cranial nerves 9th, 10th, and 11th. The 9th is placed superiorly, while the 10th is in the middle. The 11th is placed inferiorly. The remaining cranial nerves associated with the medulla issue from the cerebellopontine angle. This is the junction between the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla. The nerves are as follows: vestibulocochlear nerve, which is placed inferiorly; facial nerve, which is placed superiorly; nervus intermedius, which is placed in between the two. At the lower level of the medulla, the following are prominent: pyramidal decussation. These are so clearly evident that it is easy to see the decussation within the anteromedian sulcus. The decussation stops at the spino-medullary junction. The olive is only formed at its rostral level. Also, there is no pyramid because the structure that forms the pyramid have begun to decossate at the lower level of the medulla. Dorsal surface. The dorsal surface can be easily described by dividing the medulla into the two parts we had mentioned. An upper medulla, which is also called the open medulla, and a lower medulla, which is also called the closed medulla. The lower medulla has the following important features at the back of that structure. Tuberculum gracilis. This is the swelling which forms the nucleus gracilis within the medullary substance. Tuberculum cuneatus. This also forms the nucleus cuneatus. Accessory cuneate nucleus. The tuberculum gracilis is placed just lateral to the posterior median septum, which is continuous with that of the spinal cord. The tuberculum cuneatus is placed lateral and above the tuberculum gracilis. The accessory cuneate nucleus is placed lateral to the tuberculum cuneatus. All the structures hitherto mentioned can be easily found inferior to the floor of the fourth ventricle. At the upper medulla, the fourth ventricle comes into view. It has the following features: a floor which is diamond shaped and therefore called rhomboid fossa, a roof which is covered by thylakoid and the inferior medullary velum at the back of the medulla. The rhomboid fossa, and indeed the whole of the fourth ventricle, extends to the back of the pons. Its lower limit or inferior edge forms the calamus scriptorius. At the lateral edge of the calamus scriptorius is the obex. Lateral and slightly superior to the obex is the hypoglossal trigone. Above this trigone is the vagal trigone. At the junction between the pons and the medulla, we have a striae medullaris. At this junction, two lateral recesses of the fourth ventricle are found. They are the foramina of Luschka. Surrounding the junction between the pons and the medulla is the vestibular area, which is found within the tuberculum acousticum. But above the vestibular area and directly behind the pons is the fascia colliculus. This colliculus is made up of internal structures as follows: the abducens nucleus, the internal genome of the facial nerve. The lateral surface of medulla has only the inferior cerebellar peduncle. This peduncle begins in the lower medulla and appears on the lateral aspect of the upper medulla to course into the cerebellum. It will carry fibers from the inferior olive to reach the cerebellar nucleus. Internal organization of the medulla. The medulla can be described again from a point of view of two parts, that is, the open, which is the upper medulla, and the closed, which is the lower medulla. We shall take the lower medulla first. The configuration of the lower medulla is similar to that of the spinal cord, but this changes gradually as the spinal medullary junction is reached. Number 1. The formation of the spinal tract and nucleus of the trigeminal nerve at the level of C4 up to the higher cervical levels changes the configuration of the substantia gelatinosa so that it becomes bulbous. This configuration is maintained to higher levels of the medulla. Number 2. The formation of the pyramidal tract and their decossation also changes the configuration of the ventral horn of the gray matter. It is cut off at its bottom by the decossating fibers of the lower medulla, so that the medullary gray matter now looks like a butterfly, together with the bulbous spinal tract of 5, rather than the usual H shape of the spinal gray matter. The formation of the corticospinal tract in the lower medulla leads to the infringement on the gray matter of the ventral horn, so that a reticular pattern is now formed. This reticular formation or pattern is the beginning of a reticular formation. The last is the third point. The fourth point is as follows. The posterior column tract now begins to terminate on their various nuclei, which are the nucleus gracilis, the nucleus cuneatus, and the accessory cuneate nucleus. The second order neurons of the pathway now begin to issue from their nuclei, They will project as internal arcuate fibers, which sweep across the dorsal to the ventral aspect of the lower medulla in order to reach the contralateral medial lemniscus. But these fibers decussate ventrally and form the medial lemniscus of the opposite side. Point number 5. The formation of the medial lemniscus is a feature of all levels of medulla, beginning from the lower medulla upwards. Point number 6. Spinal lemniscus is a continuation of the lateral funiculus, which begins from the spinal cord levels. They include the spinothalamic tract and the spinocerebellar tract. And finally, the central canal is maintained just like it is in the spinal cord. Welcome to the second part of the medulla. Now we shall talk about the upper medulla. At the upper medulla, the following structures are seen internally: inferior olive, pyramid, inferior cerebellar peduncle, fourth ventricle, and the cranial nucleus at its floor, and then medullary reticular formation. We shall take these structures one by one. The inferior olive. The olive, which is seen externally at the open or upper medulla, is called internally the inferior olive or the inferior olivary nuclear complex. It has the following nuclear groups: the principal inferior olivary nucleus, accessory dorsal olivary nucleus, accessory medial olivary nucleus. The olive projects 2/3 of the fibers which enter the inferior cerebellar peduncle in order to reach the cerebellum. Hence, its main function is to provide a center for the interconnection between the medulla and the cerebellum. Being inferior in the neuraxis, it is therefore quite primitive. The olive has efferent projections from various parts of the brain and spinal cord. They include spino-olivary tract, cortico-olivary tract from the cortex, and then fibers from the midbrain at the periaqueductal gray and the red nucleus. The fibers coming from the red nucleus are called the rubro-olivary tract. White matter of the olive is called the ammiculum olivae. The pyramids. The pyramid contains corticospinal tracts, which are 3 in number. Lateral corticospinal tract, which begins decussation at the lower medulla and ends its decussation at the spino-medullary junction. Number 2, you have the anterolateral corticospinal tract. And the last one, you have the anterior corticospinal tract. The last 2 are uncrossed tracts. Inferior cerebellar peduncle. This begins at the upper medulla and crosses lateral to the fourth ventricle and anterior to it. It is also lateral and dorsal to the olive. It enters the cerebellum and sweeps across the vestibular and cochlear nuclei at the pontomedullary junction. The medullary reticular formation. The medullary reticular formation is the highest motor coordinating center in lower vertebrates like fishes. It projects fibers to the spinal cord as reticulospinal tract, and fibers reaching from various parts of the brain keep it under control. Hence, we have the cortico-reticular fibers. Also, fibers project from medullary reticular formation to the higher cortical centers. These fibers represent the so-called ascending reticular activating system, or ARAS, or reticular formation for short. This formation is responsible for arousal and hence keeps the individual at his very conscious self. It is acted upon by various fibers coming from the neuraxis. It is blocked by certain anesthetic agents such as ketamine. The medullary reticular formation is divided into 2 parts. We have a lateral group and then a medial group. The medial group is further divided into nucleus reticularis gigantocellular and a nucleus reticularis parvocellularis. The last carries very large cells, while the next to it, that is the parvocellularis, only small cells. The inferior cerebellar peduncle is one of the three peduncles that interconnect the cerebellum with the brainstem. It carries fibers of the posterior spinocerebellar tract, which form 1/3 of its fibers. It also carries fibers from the cuneo-cerebellar tract, beginning from the accessory cuneate nucleus. But 2/3 of its fibers are projections from the inferior olive in the tract called the olivocerebellar tract. Cranial nerve nuclei are found in abundance in the fourth ventricle at its floor. The hypoglossal nucleus lies in the hypoglossal trigone at the extreme inferior edge of the floor of the fourth ventricle. It lies above the obex and lateral to the area postrema, but below the vagal trigone. It contains nucleus of this nerve, which carries general somatic efferent fibers to intrinsic and extrinsic muscles of the tongue, excepting the palatoglossus. It is a new addition to the cranial nerves of vertebrates, of fishes and lower vertebrates like the hypoglossal nerve. It may also carry general somatic efferent fibers to the meninges of the posterior cranial fossa, but this is doubtful. When this nerve is damaged, it will cause an ipsilateral hemiparesis of the tongue. In the condition known as inferior alternating hemiplegia, there is a contralateral hemiplegia and an ipsilateral hemiparesis of the tongue, presumably due to the closeness of the pyramids to the hypoglossal nucleus, so that damage to one may also affect the other. Because the fibers of the hypoglossal nerve are not crossed, we then obtain an ipsilateral hemiparesis of the tongue. The accessory nerve is the 11th cranial nerve. It has two components: the spinal accessory